You know what
Backpacking America
is, right?
It's fucking awesome.
It's Backpacking America, an analytical podcast. All right, so I got Dr. Compton here. He is do you guys use chairs anymore, or is it department head?
Yeah, we have chairs. So yeah, I'm chair of the Africana Latinx Studies Department, and I'm professor of political science as well as Africana Latinx Studies.
And you are on the Community Police Advisory Board.
Well, it depends on what you mean by community, because there's community as in Oneonta, the city of Oneonta, and I'm actually a subcommittee chair for that, for a police advisory board. And then we also have one on campus regarding UPD, and that was actually assigned to me by former President Barbara Jean Morris, and continued under President Dennis Craig. So, that's sort of the situation as it stands now. Both of them are making progress. The city one in particular, we're starting to put together recommendations, and so that's where we are at. There's some discussion there of surveys, and that is available, by the way. On the meetings are on YouTube. There's a city YouTube channel. As far as the campus one is concerned, the committee's been formed. We have created a survey. We're making final adjustments to the survey. It's a group of 7 individuals, 7 or 8, losing track. And so the survey is almost done. And we want to get the student participation as well as staff and faculty when the survey comes out. In addition to that, we'll be contacting expert witnesses and those who will have an impact on the final report at the campus level, the UPD. And in addition to that, what we're going to be doing is we've been looking over a lot of files and data. So whether we're talking about the city's advisory board or the campus board, committee, I should say, with the campus, we have a lot of data that both police departments have provided. And so that's the nature of where we are at now. Of course, we're all really quite busy, and there's a lot going on. It's very difficult to try to get the schedule synchronized when you have large. I mean, we're starting the semester, and it's really the busy time of the of the year. So, and of course, COVID doesn't make the situation better. So at least on the campus level, we're very concerned about making sure that we get a good turnout, right? Because if the survey is not put together properly, or there's a very low turnout, then the results become problematic.
I see.
Right? And I think with surveys, you want to have a degree of, you want to be able to conduct surveys that are similar without changing the question. So you have longitudinal data. In other words, data over time is really important. So you can kind of measure progress. So that's sort of where we are at now.
So you guys are in the very beginning stages, and you have some recommendations for UPD. Are you able to share what some of these recommendations are?
There aren't recommendations at this time in regards to with the UPD. There are some recommendations in regards to the city one. So I guess I'm not exactly sure what the focus of this discussion is, whether you want to focus on the UPD version or you're talking about the city.
Oh, I'm just talking about UPD.
And if it's about the city, okay, all right. Because if it's about the city, there is a chair for that. Biama Charles, she's an employee over at Hartwick, so she would be the person to speak to.
I see.
On this campus, we were going through the data now, But we're looking at several areas, including emergency management, campus interaction of the police with members of the community, um, issues of a training and what constitutes the training versus what actually happens in the field. Uh, those kinds of issues. Chain of command is an issue. Complaint procedures, processes come up. In other words, if there are issues that are involving police officers, how is that handled on campus? There is a committee on campus. It's an advisory board that looks into operations of the police and addresses the complaints. So we want to look at how that's structured, how often it meets is an important issue. In the past, there were some cases of UPD, participate in a defense surplus program, which is basically a program by which UPD can pick up a variety of defense from the Department of Defense surplus materials, such as the Humvee. Uh, they got the rifles, those kinds of things in the past, and so we want to ascertain whether that process is still taking place. And you probably saw an email and an announcement by the president towards the end of last semester, which focused on chain of command and reporting. So now the police reports directly to the president. So the president is informed on a regular basis as to what's going on campus. That would be something that the committee would support. The other thing that we are looking at is the way that the police officers are recruited to seek to strategies that can help to diversify the police force. Um, so the scope is quite broad. Another issue is one of mutual support, because as you know, Oneonta has this area has five jurisdictions in terms of police. There are five different police forces. And so they usually have mutual aid agreements, right? And what are the demarcations in terms of a jurisdiction? Meaning that, to what extent are city police involved on campus, and what function does our police have in the context of students off campus? Right, those kinds of issues. And so we've had to gather a lot of documents, including mutual aid agreements and those kinds of things. So Chief Philo was particularly helpful in that regard, because she did provide a significant amount of documents. And we're looking at probably about 100 pages of documents. So it's a lengthy process. Right, and some of the things, and by the way, in the case of this Oneonta, the college at Oneonta's a task force, it's not mandated by the governor at all, whereas cities and municipalities are. So there are a series of task force out there for municipalities and counties that has been ordered by the governor. But on this campus, it's been proactive. The former president was proactive and wanted, after the governor made that request, that municipalities and counties and towns report back about their police force. That Barbara Jean Morris actually wanted to be proactive on this campus in that regard.
Oh wow, I didn't even know that. I thought college campuses had to do that. So I'm
No,
glad she did that.
no.
What are some of the goals of the Oneonta UPD task force?
Well, I think several things. It's important that we get a clear picture, right? So there's an element of transparency, a clear picture in terms of what the college at Oneonta community thinks about the UPD, right? Because ultimately, UPD's function is to serve and to protect. So we want to make sure that one, UPD acts in a transparent way. Number two, that that the community is comfortable with the level of policing and their effectiveness, because the legitimacy of the police force is really important for it to be able to conduct its mission on campus. There's some discussion that's going on in regards to the arming existence. This was a big issue in the 1990s about arming UPD. Um, and there has been some discussion about that. But all UPD forces throughout the SUNY system is now armed. But policing a college campus is very different from that of policing a municipality or city, or county. So we're quite different in that regard, what the UPD does and what the college campus is about.
How's it
We also
different?
have a large number of students. How's it different? Well, one, you're dealing with a residential population of students that come from a variety of places, right? So throughout New York State. So in the case of cities, yes, you do have people moving in, but it's not a transient population to the extent that colleges are. In other words, every 4 years, new students come on board. Well, every year, new students come on board, and within 4 years, most of the time, those students leave. And they come from throughout New York State. So that makes it very important because in terms of the police orientation process with the students, right? In other words, people have different experiences or differing experiences with police. So, in other words, somebody who is from Westchester County or Long Island or New York City or Syracuse would have a different understanding of police and different experience with police. And there has to be some degree of understanding of what the functions of university police actually are, and how to interact with Oneonta UPD is a little bit different than interaction with, say, New York City police or state troopers. Um,
Right.
there's a lot more, I believe, an aspect of community policing that takes place.
So is
Right?
this
I mean, Oneonta, for example, is a relatively safe community, and I'm talking about the college in particular. So, things like use of force and the kinds of things that pertain to larger municipalities, are a little bit different in our context.
okay? That makes sense then.
Does that make sense, Anthony?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So bearing all that in mind, like what power does the advisory board actually have?
Well, it is advisory. Um, we're not a policy making body in any way. The report will become public. The data, in terms of the documents that was shared by UPD, will not become public, and the reason why is some of it contains very sensitive material. But the report will become public, and my expectation is that there'll be copies available in the library as an example of that. And I suspect that the president and the UPD would, send some kind of information about its availability, as well as an executive summary.
Okay.
So it really is in the hands of the president and the administration to examine the recommendations and have a discussion about those recommendations.
Okay. So
So
that
the logic of the report is not is it's not a political document in any way. It is essentially a fact-finding clarification kind of report that looks at the police's relationship with the Oneonta community and the procedures and processes that they have in place.
I see. So
So
now
it is an informative document. Right?
that's good. I like hearing that. And that's what I kind of figured the advisory board would be. Um, I'm glad to hear that UPD is actually willingly cooperating with the advisory board.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And by the way, it's not an advisory board because there's a separate advisory board that exists. We are essentially a task force. Right? So
Okay,
task
that's
force
what I'm.
customarily, right, put a report together, and then it disbands. In other words, its work is done at that point. Right? There's a sunset. It doesn't continue to go on forever. Now you can reactivate, on say a regular process every 3 years or every 5 years, and recreate the task force to see what progress has been made. That's fine, but our job is not to, on a day-to-day basis or semester basis, see observe what the police department on campus, the UPD, what they're actually doing. That's not the job of the task force.
So, just for
It is to take a
clarification,
snapshot. Yes.
so there's a task force for the UPD, and there's an
Yes,
advisory
that's
board.
newly formed one by the president. Yes, and there's been an existing civilian, almost like I would say, I don't have the correct terminology in front of me, but it is what there is a civilian, almost like a civilian oversight board that was created under President Klinuski, which consists of members of the community, including students. And the logic behind that is to review the activities of UPD, especially as it pertains to student arrests and other types of actions that the police take on campus. So that's their function. So they're on a regular basis. They're to be informed and meet.
I
Right?
see.
Whereas this committee has a degree of autonomy. Right? So in the meetings, for example, the police chief and the president are not present. Right? And so it has that level of, I would say, autonomy, but it does have a defined scope in terms of what we're supposed to do.
So
Right?
you raised an interesting point of what the task force found, and I really wanted to go back to it. You said that since the '90s, UPD has been armed. Does that have connection with the blacklist, or is that a separate policy?
Well, my understanding of the situation, based on people that I have spoken to, this is a SUNY-wide decision. There was a lot of debate on various campuses, right, including protests, frankly, about whether you needed to arm the police. But it was a SUNY-wide issue, and it wasn't a choice where each campus had the authority to make the decision whether they're going to be armed or unarmed. In other words, the debate was about whether UPD, in other words, the entire university system, right, officers should be armed or not. And so the logic of the police department at that time, from my understanding, was that a lot of times the UPD was looked upon primarily as security, right? And that they were not fully trained officers. So there was a sense that some officers felt that they were second class without the appropriate training. But UPD now is there's a whole certification process and a review process that takes place in terms of their training, recruitment, training, evaluation, and certification, accreditation. Right? And part of that involves a firearm training. So they are a bona fide police force, right? And that was the logic of arming the police was to UPD was to um, the entire systems UPD, I should say, um, was specifically to upgrade its status and its capabilities and professionalism, right? And you could talk more with the police chief about that because that's more her area, but that's my understanding of how that came to pass.
So now that you guys are in the task force and the topic of arms has been breached. What is the consensus of the task force on the necessity of arms for UPD?
Well, I don't think there is a consensus at this time in regards to uh, arms. There is quite a bit of there is a consensus emerging about the importance of community policing and visibility. That in particular, that the model of where you have police officers, UPD officers in cars and driving around on campus is not sufficient. And I think UPD also recognizes that, and they've been working on that over the past few years. Um, but it would be nice to see, in our opinion, more interaction between UPD as members of the community and the people in the community, and whether, you know, whether when they're so-called quote walking the beat, whether they ought to be armed or not has come up. In other words, is it really necessary for the police officers who are going through, let's say, Mills or Fitzell, just walking around, just observing, whether at that time they need to walk around in full armed gear? Is that really, I shall put it, congruent with the idea of community policing?
You see, from a student perspective, I guess, I don't think that that's necessary. Only because I think it's necessary that they have access to arms, like in the instance of that shooting threat that we had, where they were able to respond quickly with
Right.
necessary force. That's essential in today's world. That's just where we live. But to walk around fully militarized, it definitely scares a lot of people, and that would be like my
Yeah,
immediate concern.
we recognize that. I think there is an emerging direction within that within uh, the committee that uh, that's very off-putting. That students as well as faculty and staff uh, feel that it does create that distance when they are armed to that extent.
Oh yeah, I mean, especially with a lot of our students of color. It's you see it on Twitter, you see it on the news, the shootings, and then you have some guy in Mills with a gun, and you can't even have a gun. It's just it's scary, and I'm glad the committee actually recognizes that, and that this discussion's occurring. Do you think there's
Right.
like any
Yeah, I mean, the
setback?
other issue is, go ahead,
No, I was
Anthony.
just gonna say, do you see any
What?
potential setbacks with the task force and the police and like communication or actually implementing new reforms?
Well, we're not in charge in implementing reforms. Um, we're merely providing the report.
Right.
So, whether that task force gets reconstituted or continues in some form to see how implementation takes place, one would be at the discretion of the president as well as the president in consultation with key stakeholders. It's not really the function of the committee as it is designed. In other words, the committee is meant to, at this point, produce a report and then disband, essentially. It can be reconstituted, but it's not meant to continue.
So I guess the proper question would be, now that this
Frankly,
report
personally, I
is
wouldn't want it to continue. Personally, I wouldn't want it to continue because it is a lot of work, and I need that sunset for my own. You don't want to get too fatigued and burnt out. So, there's lots of things on the plate right now that we're all dealing with. So,
yeah. No, I agree. But once that report's created, um, what happens next?
well, one, it becomes publicly available. The president, obviously, and the administration will react to it, right? We'll probably figure out what they want to deal with, what some timetables, etc., and what areas that they would like to implement, and have a discussion with the community. That's my expectation. I mean, we will be in the spring, we'll have the survey, and we'll have a couple of, public forums for people to participate. I mean, I had hoped that this COVID would dissipate because obviously forums are much better in person rather than online.
Yeah.
So that's sort of our concern,
My concern is
because
that
low
COVID
attendance and low
is.
participation is problematic.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with COVID, I know not a lot of people are coming back who don't really have the energy. And that's my one concern. My other concern is that there's not a body to force administration to meet deadlines. That's just like my concern. I mean, I'm not a fan of like the SA as an administrative body, but even if you put SA in charge of making sure the deadlines were met and pushing administration along just to make sure that there were at least conversations, that's like my major concern is what if this just gets swept under the rug after the report is made?
Well, several things. Anything can be, you know, placed on a shelf and then forgotten, right? But
Right.
that's really the function of two. Well, one, it's a function of the community at large. In other words, various entities on campus need to raise concerns if recommendations are not addressed in any way, or particular concerns are not addressed. That's number one. And then number two, you do have the civilian oversight board, so to speak, that exists. And that, when it comes to implementation, I would think that body plays a critical role in terms of implementation timetables. Um, and a lot of that also depends on the budget situation, which is quite dire, frankly, in New York State. Um, you know, higher education is in a state of a transformation, and things are going to be quite different as we move forward. In what ways? The number of students, the modalities of teaching, and the budget situation. Because reforms will frequently require budgetary expenses. Such as, you say, what kinds of things? I mean, something as basic as body cam, right? And the storage of that information, and who has access, and where is all of this going to be stored, and for how long, and who's going to oversee all of this, the processes. So, I think there are a lot of unknowns. I mean, it's useful to have timetables, and the main thing is we want to start to see progress in areas, despite the unforeseen circumstances under which we operate.
Right. Now, the police. Now, do you know what the police reaction is to the task force and to the community oversight board?
I think the community oversight board has already been in practice,
No, no, no.
right?
I
I
mean,
mean,
like,
I have a copy of the latest.
what's the police reaction? Like,
So,
what is their response to working with you guys?
well, one, they've been very collaborative in the sense of providing information that we need, requests for information. Um, I I think that the police in particular realize that you know the committee is composed of reasonable people. In other words, yes, we question issues of funding, the level of funding, and what money is being allocated for. But we have not advocated, nor I don't think none of us believe that there should be no security or no police on campus. I mean, we don't start with that assumption at all, right? So we're not about defunding UPD. We're interested in appropriate funding, right, and the allocation of that money and what it's being used for, right? You know, we support training, but what kind of training is that money being used for? Is that training effective? And then does that training lead to changes in terms of operations on the field? Those kinds of issues. So, I think any police department, whether we're talking about college, university, or whether we're talking about municipal police or state troopers, really need, I mean, they know that ultimately they have to have a working relationship with their constituents. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to do their job effectively. And in addition to that, I mean, they are being paid for by taxpayer money, and in the case of UPD, tuition. So ultimately, they are accountable to the community that they serve. And, in particular, it takes a particular kind of person, I believe, and I think the police chief would agree with this, a particular kind of person to be a university police officer, right? It's not the kind of policing that takes place, say, in a city like Camden, New Jersey, right? Uh, you know, it's a different kind of policing, right? So we discuss things, including things like de-escalation, right? We dealing with the police officers' mental health is important, especially the way that police officers are being ostracized in a lot of communities. It's not an easy job any longer, right? If it ever was. I mean, it's very difficult now because the police officer's presence itself creates various perceptions, right? And even perceptions of animosity, right? Because of the behavior of certain police officers and certain police forces.
So what steps are being taken to ensure their mental health is being taken care of?
Well, that's actually a function of the committee. And part of what we're going to do is we're going to be talking to various police officers, UPD officers, to get their take on things, right? Because nobody wants to do their job and feel that they are disliked, or that they are perceived as the enemy. But nowadays in society, due to the abuses by police officers, um, many that the entire police force and that profession is seen as abusive, and is ostracized, you know, and that's a problem. I'd like to think that university police is different, and we should chart a different path or trajectory, because the experiences of our students with UPD is also going to affect the way that they view police forces in general, long after they graduate.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been some interesting stories that I've heard, such as being stopped and questioned, randomly. There's been they've been
Yeah,
followed around. I was at a protest. Actually, do you remember that what was that protest that we were at? The environmental action one where they led a march?
that was an Earth Day,
That
if
was
I'm
Earth
correct.
Day. Yeah, there was a
Yeah, yeah.
police officer. He approached us and he said, what's going on here, and just kind of being weird. So like, but it's been nothing like to the level that we've seen in the national news, which I'm very appreciative
Right.
of. Um, where there hasn't been discharges of weapons, there hasn't been like takedowns or brutal headlocks or misuse of
Right.
weapons. So I
And
think
I don't think people in the community here would tolerate that kind of behavior.
no,
To be honest,
no, not at all. No, no, no.
um, you know, I mean, I'm not. I don't think it's a bad idea to have police present for demonstrations, or even to ask questions. But at the same time, it raises the question: to what extent should they be armed when they do that? Right?
Right.
I mean, you know, because we do
It's
have, as members of the community, the Oneonta community, the college community. I mean, we do have the right to organize, demonstrations, protests, petitions, etc. Right? It is the police's responsibility to make sure that it doesn't turn violent and lead to vandalism and destruction of property. Uh, you know, that is, in my opinion, that is their job.
Right. But I think
How they
like,
go about that is another matter.
what do you
Right?
think
In other words, we
would
should
be
not feel
appropriate?
intimidated by police asking us questions.
Right.
Right? And
What
part of that is one, building trust. And building trust takes a long period of time, especially because of the nature of policing and the history of policing in the United States, especially regarding communities of color and African American community in particular.
So bearing that in mind, what do you think would be the appropriate response to a protest? What do you think, especially in general, what do you think the police should have on their tool belt when they go about the beat or patrolling a protest?
Well, clearly, one, uh, you want to see what the tone of the behavior of the officer is, right? Is it informational? Is it accusatory? Because we do have the right to, as citizens of the community, the right to protest peacefully. We do, right? And that is important that we have that right. But is the question confrontational, right? I mean, clearly, a lot of times the police officers know what the purpose of that is. Right? If they look around, instead the question could go along something like this: So how's it going? Is everything all right? Finish,
Hmm.
right? Not along the lines of, what are you doing here? You think you should be doing this? That's a different tone. Now, in terms of a uniform, uh, and what kind of weapons that they have. It may be that the college as a whole comes to the conclusion that in those kinds of situations, when there is no violence, or threat of violence, and that requires obviously threat assessment, but the police, on a routine matter, should not be armed. Right? And similar situation in terms of residence hall. When there is issues of noise or potential, say, for example, the RA calls in the police, dealing with a drug potential, say, marijuana. I mean, is that really something that the police need to be called in for? And should the police be armed when they arrive? I mean, they're two separate questions. There may be other ways to handle that situation.
I agree. I agree. I don't think a gun is necessarily needed. I would say a taser, sure, but like a gun, should be
Right.
in the most dire situation, especially on a campus.
And I
Another
mean, tasers have their own issues too, though, right? Now, there's
right.
people could have medical conditions, and ironically, a taser could be more deadly than a gun for certain individuals.
Oh, oh
Right?
wow,
In
that's
other words,
interesting.
heart conditions, right?
Right.
You use a taser on somebody, and it creates a cardiac arrest situation versus shooting someone in the leg, as an example. There's a big difference, right?
Right.
So
So
weapons,
what do you
different
think?
weapons have different impact on different individuals, especially when we're talking about tasers or any kind of chokeholds, which we don't have that on this campus. But the emphasis should be on de-escalation, right? And police do go through de-escalation training, and it does take a particular kind of a police officer, um, to be on UPD rather than, and that they are cognizant of that. There have been police officers in the past that have been urged to leave the force, even removed, because their approach to policing was not suitable for the community. That has occurred.
What type of officer would be suitable for UPD? Like what type of person?
Well, I can't really speak for a UPD because I'm not with UPD, but I think the committee, understands, as you know, explained to us by Chief Viola, that a police officer for UPD, has to have the kind of temperament that's able to, get along with students, right, and have experience dealing with people from a variety of backgrounds and various locations from the country. They have to be people oriented. Right? It's not just about technical expertise and training in terms of the use of weapons. That's not what the kind of that's not a hallmark for a successful UPD officer. I think they understand that, you know.
Right.
But I
And it
think the
comes
community as a whole needs to understand that UPD is their one, their hiring practices and their temperament and their objectives very different from the standard police force that they may be used to. And I don't think that message is particularly understood.
I don't think so either. It's especially at the student body, we're very distrustful of the police in general. And this kind of feeds into to my next question. When we talk about them interacting with the community and us interacting with them, what would be appropriate events to do that? How would that occur? I know they have coffee with a cop, but how do you foster that?
Right? I'm not so sure that coffee with a cop is particularly effective, because if you don't particularly care for police officers, you're not going to go for coffee with a cop, right?
Right.
I mean, you're pretty much going to be meeting with people who, as a police officer, the police officer will be meeting with people who want to meet with a police officer.
Right.
So it's almost like you're preaching to the choir, so to speak. Right. So, in particular, orientation, right? Orientation week. What's the function of the UPD in terms of meeting with the students during orientation week for new students, as an example? Okay, inviting police officers for appropriate topics, right, especially criminal justice courses, to make brief presentations of what's going on, right? UPD, working with college students for internships, creating internship positions, and working actually across the street or the road with a Job Corps, right? And internships for Job Corps students. Um, so there's a variety of ways that you can create that kind of community building. And at the same time, because police officers have authority and they have force, you have to have a system of checks and balances. And that's where, one, the, uh, the, the advisory board itself, right, plays an important role in that context. And by police UPD releasing information on a timely basis, like that, and on a regular basis, that also helps to build trust. UPD, for example, the police chief could, for example, give a presentation about the state of policing on campus to the SA as well as to the College Senate once a year. Right? Those kinds of things that will help to get people's understanding of what is the function of the police on this campus.
Right. Okay, that's agreeable. Um I feel like though for the average student, like I like what you said about the criminal justice where the police come in. I think that's necessary, especially if you're a criminal justice major. I think that's necessary. But I'm talking about like the mass comm student or like the bio student. What for us and those different types of majors, how would we come into contact with police and how would we be a part of that community police initiative?
Oh, okay. Well, here's an interesting situation, right? If you look at biology, well, one of the things that UPD handles is emergency management, right? So emergency management also deals with toxic chemicals and chemical spills, right? Falls into that jurisdiction of policing on campus. So
Mm,
that fits right into biology. And as far as mass communication is concerned, Police are always involved in mass communication, right? Communicating, one, what they're doing, why they do it, and then when a crisis occurs, working to resolve that crisis, right? Crisis resolution.
Hmm. But how would that?
Right?
How would the programs? Like who would be? What I mean is like what would we do? Like how would the police work with these different students outside of like the criminal justice and job corps? Um, because you had
Well, one, mm,
no, go ahead,
you
go
have
ahead.
the potential internship programs, yeah, internship programs, and also faculty can invite somebody to come and speak. Student groups can invite the police officers to come and speak if their specialty is, let's say, dealing with cyberbullying,
Hmm.
right? Have a police officer that deals with cyberbullying on campus come and speak about cyberbullying, uh, in a communications class or a communications club. I mean, they're part of the community. If they're a resource, we should use them.
I see. So this is it is a two-way street then. It is very much
Yeah,
a
it's a
two-way
two-way
street.
street.
So that's gonna okay. I can see that happening once trust is fully earned. I'm wondering what the building blocks will be like. How would students and police end up forming that trust? Is more, I guess, a question that's ringing in my head right now. How do we get to that point?
Well, it's a working relationship, right? And trust is not a question of whether there's trust or there isn't trust. We're talking about degrees of trust,
Mm,
right? Or degrees of distrust.
mm,
Okay, so I think orientation is really important, right? Especially in two ways. One, when we deal with EOP and CADE, right? Orientation in that context, the summer program that exists for uh, EOP and ACE, but also the general student orientation. In other words, your first interaction with the police should not be a ticket
right.
on campus,
Yeah.
right? Your first interaction with the police should not be somebody showing up in your dorm with a gun,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I agree.
And so orientation can play a very useful role, a starting point.
But what about beyond orientation?
Hold on here. What's going
Sure.
on here? Okay. All right. Just making sure of the time here. Uh, uh, okay. I have a couple more minutes and then I'm going to have to another meeting. You can't make this up.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So what was your question one more time?
So beyond orientation, how can the police be present in students' lives before that first ticket?
One is the idea of community policing, right, that I raised before. In other words, if the police are walking around and having conversations just to get to know people, right? In other words, if they're serving a community, they need to know what community they're serving. Keep in mind that students come and go. In other words, not only are they from different parts of the state, they graduate, they move on, a new group of students come in. So it's a constant process of renewal, right?
I
So
see.
it makes more incumbent that the police officers engage in community policing. But at the same time, they're members of the community, but they are police officers. So they're not your friends. That's different, right? They can be friendly, but they're not your friends. They have a particular role to play. And so police officers will be have been and need to be educated about that.
Interesting.
They're not our buddies.
Right.
They're not our friends. They're friendly. They have a role to play. And so there has to be an appropriate distance. It's the same sort of logic of faculty and students, right?
Right.
You can be friendly to faculty, but you don't become buddies with a student. That's weird,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I mean, think about it. It's the same thing with police officers. They're not gonna tell you all their thoughts, and you're buddy with the police officer, and you're going out drinking with the police officer. I mean, come on, right? It's different. They're not your buddies. They're not your friends. They can be friendly, right, cordial, and that's to be expected. get to know you as a person. They could even be mentors and to some degree even perform functions of a role model. But that doesn't mean that they're your buddy. Right? There's a difference, I think.
I see.
But anyway,
Well, thank you
if I
so
may
much.
go to my next.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
sure.
Thank you so
Sorry.
much for coming
Yeah,
on.
you're
Don't
very
be
welcome.
sorry. It's a busy time, and I'm sorry about the lag. I feel like there's a delay, but I appreciate you coming on again. And in the next time you want to come on, please don't hesitate. Thanks for listening, y'all. Make sure to give BPA a follow on Instagram at Backpacking America and Twitter at BPA Podcasting. Make sure to like BPA on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube. The links can be found in the podcast description. Until then, take it easy and stay breezy.